There is a person in your life who has been holding something inside themselves for far longer than they would ever feel comfortable admitting out loud. Not for weeks, not for a month or two, for longer than that, considerably longer, and with a consistency that their outward behavior has never accurately reflected. What has been happening inside them bears almost no resemblance to the story their actions have been telling. They did not simply wake up one morning and discover that their feelings had naturally run their course and faded away cleanly. They did not actually move on in the way they may have appeared to from the outside, the way their silence or their distance or their seeming indifference suggested to anyone observing. The reality of what happened was far quieter and far more gradual than any of that, and it unfolded almost entirely beneath the surface where nobody, possibly not even they themselves, could clearly see it. What they did was push their genuine feelings downward, not because those feelings were not real, but because they genuinely did not know what to do with them. They lacked the tools, the readiness, the emotional vocabulary, and perhaps the courage to meet those feelings honestly and act on what they were communicating. So, they buried them with whatever was available. Distraction, busyness, the maintenance of a composed and functioning exterior that gave no indication of what was actually being stored underneath it. They told themselves that staying quiet was the rational choice, maybe even the kind choice, that keeping everything at a distance was less complicated and less risky than the alternative. But feelings that are buried do not dissolve. They do not cooperate with the wish that they would simply become smaller over time and eventually disappear. What they actually do is wait. They sit in the dark, and they grow heavier, day by day, week by week, accumulating a kind of pressure that is invisible until the moment it is no longer manageable. And that moment, the moment when all of that accumulated weight finally forces its way to the surface, is precisely where this message is coming from right now. It is not coming from a place of confidence or courage or inner peace. It is coming from fear, from the specific and destabilizing fear that too much time may have already slipped by without the action that was always needed. Something shifted in them recently in a way that was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Maybe they encountered something that brought you immediately and powerfully to mind. Maybe your name came up in a conversation they were not prepared for, and the impact of hearing it surprised them with its intensity. Maybe life simply went quiet enough around them, enough distractions fell away or became insufficient, that the truth which had been waiting underneath everything finally became louder than anything they could use to cover it. Whatever the specific trigger was, it reached them in a way that previous moments of recognition had not quite managed. One thought landed with a weight and clarity that earlier versions of the same thought had lacked. The possibility that they might lose you in a way that cannot be recovered from, cannot be apologized into reversal, cannot be undone by eventually saying the right words once sufficient time has passed. That possibility, which they had been successfully avoiding truly confronting, finally became undeniable, and it did not arrive at a convenient moment. It did not surface during a busy afternoon when the momentum of activity could have carried them past it. It arrived in the kind of moment that offers no such protection. Late at night, when the world was quiet and there was nothing left to occupy the part of the mind that needed to be occupied. During stretches when their phone offered nothing meaningful and the company of other people felt shallow compared to the specific quality of what they had experienced with you. When the noise of ordinary life finally went still enough that the silence began asking questions they could no longer redirect. They reached a point where avoidance had exhausted its own resources, where looking away was no longer a viable option, and they were left with no choice but to actually look directly at what they had been circling around. What they found when they looked was not comfortable. They found themselves confronted with a series of realizations that arrived in sequence, each one adding weight to the one before it. Nobody else listens the way you listened. Nobody else offered the particular quality of patience that you consistently brought to the connection without making it feel like an imposition on them. Nobody else managed to understand them in the way you understood them, without requiring constant explanation, without needing things simplified or contextualized before responding with genuine comprehension. And nobody else offered comfort in the specific way you offered it, supportive without being controlling, present without being suffocating, caring without quietly turning your care into a form of leverage. When the reality of those specific and irreplaceable qualities finally became visible to them with full clarity, a feeling of urgency began building that they could not talk themselves out of. But here is something important to understand about the nature of that urgency, because it matters for how you receive what is happening. The urgency driving them right now is not purely and simply love. It is also, in significant part, the fear of permanent loss. The fear that something which cannot be replaced is about to move permanently beyond reach. Those two things, genuine feeling and fear of loss, are operating together inside them, and the combination creates a particular kind of emotional pressure that can look like readiness when it is not yet fully that. If they could speak to you right now with all the defenses stripped away, with pride and self-protection set aside, and honesty given the room it has never quite been allowed to occupy, what they would say would be something relatively simple. They should have done more. They should have acted when acting was still uncomplicated. They operated under the assumption that your patience and understanding were resources that would remain available to them on their timeline, that there was always more time, that the door would remain open regardless of how long they took to walk through it. They never truly reckoned with the fact that silence is itself a choice, and that choices generate outcomes whether they were made consciously or not. Silence, extended and unexplained, has the capacity to wound in ways that are slow and cumulative and therefore easy to underestimate while they are happening. They are only beginning to genuinely understand this now. They carry guilt for not showing up when their presence would have meant something significant. They carry guilt for staying quiet through stretches when honesty was the thing the situation was calling for. They carry guilt for allowing fear to do the deciding in moments when courage was what the moment actually required. At the time, distance felt manageable. Avoidance felt like it was protecting something, even if they could not have clearly articulated what. The illusion of control that comes from keeping emotions at arm's length felt preferable to the vulnerability of engaging honestly with feelings that did not have a safe and certain resolution. But avoidance never actually protects anyone from the consequences of their choices. It simply postpones those consequences and, in the postponing, tends to make them heavier and more complex. This person does not struggle because they feel too little. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to construct a narrative in which their behavior reflected a lack of genuine feeling. That would actually be simpler and less painful in some ways than the truth. The truth is that they struggle because they feel more than they have known how to handle. Opening honestly to you would have required them to sit with real uncertainty. It would have required risking rejection in a way that felt genuinely threatening to them. It would have required confronting aspects of themselves that they were not ready to face, patterns they had not yet examined, fears they had not yet named, emotional needs they had not yet acknowledged as legitimate. Someone once observed that whatever lives in darkness continues to direct your life from that darkness, and people tend to experience the effects as fate or bad timing or unfortunate circumstance, when what is actually happening is the quiet governance of unexamined fear. That is very close to what has been unfolding here. Fear made the decisions. Pride spoke louder than vulnerability. And eventually, silence spoke loudest of all. Those choices have now grown into consequences they can no longer minimize or look past. There is another layer to this that carries its own particular weight. They can sense that you are different now. Something in your energy has shifted in a way that registers even across distance or silence or whatever specific form the current separation between you takes. The way you carry yourself has a different quality. Your responses, when they come, have a different tone. Even your silence feels like it belongs to someone who is no longer waiting for something to change, rather than someone who is holding their breath and hoping. You may still feel things connected to them. You may still carry some part of what was real between you. But you are no longer organizing yourself around the uncertainty they generated. You are no longer chasing explanations or rehearsing conversations that never seem to resolve anything. You are no longer standing in that painful middle space where confusion controls the emotional weather and nothing is ever clearly resolved in either direction. That transformation is something they can feel, and it unsettles them in a way they were not prepared for. The reason it lands so heavily is that they depended on your particular quality of patience more than they ever consciously acknowledged. They leaned on your understanding. They took comfort in your willingness to remain present while contributing relatively little toward the maintenance of that presence. They leaned on your kindness and your generosity and your consistent tendency to move toward understanding rather than immediately toward hurt or anger when they gave you ample reason for both. All of that, while keeping their own heart carefully behind walls that rarely came down and never came down fully. They operated from a deep and unexamined assumption that you would always be there in essentially the same way, that your availability was a fixed feature of the landscape rather than something that had its own limits and its own conditions. They never seriously contemplated the possibility that you would eventually reach a point where choosing yourself became more important than maintaining a connection that was asking so much and returning so little. But you did reach that point, and the quiet decision that came from that place, the decision to stop carrying what only one person was ever really carrying, speaks with a clarity that no argument could have produced. Arguments still contain emotional investment. They still reveal that someone cares enough to fight for something, to try to reach someone, to insist on being heard. Your calmness now carries a different message. It carries the particular quality of someone who has genuinely accepted a reality rather than someone who is still fighting to change it. And that possibility, the possibility that you may be moving forward and that your life may continue without them in the role they assumed they would always occupy, follows them now in a way they cannot shake. For a long time, they convinced themselves that there would always be another opportunity, another conversation, another opening, another moment when the timing felt right enough to finally say what needed to be said. That conviction allowed them to delay indefinitely, to table the difficult thing repeatedly while maintaining the comfortable belief that the option remained available whenever they were ready for it. They are no longer certain that this is true. The uncertainty that has replaced that conviction follows them everywhere now. It surfaces during quiet evenings when there is nothing to fill the space where your particular energy used to exist. It appears when they encounter something that connects to a memory of you, and the memory arrives with a weight it did not used to carry. It rises when fragments of what existed between you come back without warning and bring with them a recognition of something they have not been able to locate anywhere else. The memories that return are not always the dramatic or significant ones. Often, they are surprisingly ordinary. A particular way a conversation moved. Something you said that reflected an understanding of them they had not expected. A moment of genuine ease between you that they wrote off at the time as nothing special and can now see was rarer than they realized. Those ordinary memories carry weight precisely because of what they were evidence of. They were evidence of being truly seen by another person, of being understood without having to perform or explain or carefully manage what was presented. Of a connection that made space for them as they actually were, not as they needed to appear. And now they find themselves in the uncomfortable territory between two feelings that do not allow much peace: regret for what was not done and fear about what may no longer be recoverable. Part of them wants to close the distance immediately, to reach out, to finally let the words that have been accumulating actually be spoken. But another part remains afraid in specific and identifiable ways. Afraid that too much time has passed for what they want to say to land the way it needs to. Afraid that the version of you they are carrying in their memory has already grown beyond the place where they left things unfinished. Afraid that their reaching out will be received as too late to change anything meaningful. And yet, despite those fears, the truth inside them keeps pressing against the boundaries they built to contain it. It keeps demanding to be acknowledged, keeps insisting that what genuinely exists between two people cannot simply be decommissioned through a decision to ignore it. They are beginning to understand now, with a clarity that has been building slowly, what it actually means to have recognized the value of something only at the moment of its potential permanent absence. Your absence does not feel like other absences feel. It has a specific texture, a specific weight. It draws a specific comparison that keeps resolving in the same direction, no matter how they approach it. You left an impression on them that has proven resistant to replacement in ways they did not fully anticipate, and the lived experience of that resistance has become its own form of information that they can no longer argue with. Every time they have moved towards something or someone else seeking something similar, the comparison has made your absence more felt rather than less. That accumulation of failed substitution has brought them to a place where denial is no longer a viable position. They are being forced now to look honestly at what fear has taken from them. Not as a theoretical exercise, but as a lived and felt confrontation with specific choices and their specific costs. They are being asked to recognize the value of what they had before that value became visible only through its loss. And they are discovering that this particular form of recognition, arriving when it does and in the form that it does, carries an extra weight of pain because it comes accompanied by the awareness that the thing it is recognizing may have already moved beyond the point of being recovered. Here is what matters most about all of this for you, and I want to be direct. This is not an instruction to wait. It is not asking you to forgive before you have arrived at forgiveness genuinely and on your own timeline. It is not suggesting that you return to the uncertainty and the pain and the one-sidedness that you already lived through. What it is offering is a clear-eyed account of what is actually happening inside this person, so that you have accurate information rather than speculation or assumption when you are deciding how you want to move forward. You mattered to them at a depth they were not capable of fully expressing when it would have counted for something. Your absence registers in their life with a significance and a volume that your presence never quite seemed to produce in the same way. What was real between you was genuinely real, even though it was handled with a lack of care and honesty that it deserved. The actual power in this situation belongs entirely to you and to whatever you decide to do with it. That is not a performance of your power, not a strategic position. It is simply the accurate description of where things actually stand. Someone feeling desperate urgency does not automatically translate into someone having done the internal work that would make things genuinely different this time. A person can sit in profound regret and still not yet possess the consistent emotional capacity that a real and functional connection requires. Regret and readiness are not the same thing, and confusing them is one of the ways this kind of dynamic repeats itself. That distinction is worth holding clearly. They are revisiting memories now with a thoroughness they have not previously applied to them. Memories they once allowed to pass without fully receiving what they were offering. The small things you did that were never performed for recognition. The times you checked in for no reason other than genuine care. The particular way you could sense the shape of their inner state before a word had been spoken and meet it with something appropriate rather than reactive. The way you consistently moved toward understanding when anger or withdrawal would have been entirely understandable responses. They are seeing all of this now in the clearer light that loss creates. And the seeing is uncomfortable because it reveals something they have to sit with. You met them at a depth they had not yet reached in themselves. You brought a quality of emotional presence to the connection that they were not yet capable of matching. And rather than rising to meet what was being offered, they withdrew from the responsibility it represented. For a significant period, they convinced themselves that the distance they were maintaining was a form of protection. Now that same distance looks entirely different from inside it. What you wanted from them was never unreasonable. You never held them to some impossible standard of perfection. You never required that they have every answer or never be confused or never struggle. What you wanted was the basic foundational thing that any genuine connection requires: for them to show up. To be honest when honesty was needed instead of defaulting to avoidance. To offer effort proportional to what was being offered to them. To be present with a consistency that matched the claims being made about what you meant to them. You were not asking them to transform into someone they were not. You were asking them to live up to what they themselves presented as their values. And only now, sitting with the consequences of not having done that, can they see clearly how many times they chose the comfortable option when the moment was asking for something more. Readiness is not something that arrives on its own because the timing finally becomes convenient. It is a choice that has to be made actively and then followed by actions that confirm the choice was real. When you showed up with honesty and presence and genuine investment, they met that offering with a partial version of themselves. They gave you access to the parts that felt safe and kept the rest behind walls that never came down. That choice is registering now as loss, and the registration is not quiet. They can sense the change in you with a precision that makes everything more acute. The way your responses carry a different quality now, the way you no longer orient yourself around their uncertainty, the way their moods and signals and mixed communications no longer seem to set the weather inside your emotional world. The quiet confidence that has settled into the space where reaching and hoping used to live. That shift changes everything about the situation. For a long time, the assumption was that your patience was essentially infinite, that your care functioned as a permanent open invitation that would remain valid on their timeline regardless of how long they took to respond to it. They mistook your patience for permanent availability. They interpreted your consistent return as a guarantee rather than as a gift that had its own conditions. What they did not adequately account for was that self-respect has a way of eventually reasserting itself. That clarity arrives when it arrives regardless of whether it is convenient. That people stop placing themselves second not out of cruelty, but out of a deep and finally unignorable recognition of their own worth. They are caught right now between two forces that pull in opposite directions. The pull toward you, toward honesty, toward finally saying what has needed to be said for longer than it should have been left unsaid. And the familiar pull of retreat, of staying in the known territory of avoidance, because the known territory, however uncomfortable, is at least familiar. They imagine stepping forward. They construct the conversation in their minds, find the words they would want to use, rehearse the moment of finally being honest without protection. But they are also learning something difficult. Imagining is not the same as doing. The willingness to picture the moment is not the same as the capacity to actually live it. Living it would require something different and harder than imagination. It would require consistent action over time. It would require proof rather than promise. And there is something else they understand that makes this harder. Words will not be enough this time, not because you have closed yourself off or become cold, but because you have grown. Because you now distinguish between what someone says in an emotional moment and what they demonstrate across the ordinary, unremarkable days that follow. You are no longer waiting to be convinced by something that is only true in the feeling of the moment and then disappears when the moment does. They know this. They can feel the difference in how you hold yourself now. Where uncertainty about your own worth once lived, something steadier and clearer has settled in. That change is real, and they can sense it. And it is one more thing that presses on them, because it makes the stakes clearer and the time genuinely shorter. Good intentions arriving late do not undo what was done. Coming forward with honesty now, however genuine, does not automatically repair what the absence of honesty over time created. They are in the early stages of understanding this, of reckoning with what it actually means to have let the important things go unsaid for as long as they did. That reckoning is necessary, it is overdue, and wherever it leads, whether toward something rebuilt or toward a finally honest ending, the truth that has been waiting inside it for all this time deserves to be what it has not been allowed to be until now. Real.